Once upon a time that never was and always will be. Once upon a time that never was and always will have been. Once upon a time that never was and always will be. They began the annual theatrical production of the Ramayana, the Ram Leela, that way. They began it that way and maybe still do at the Hanuman temple in Taos. Once upon a time that never was and always will be, where the elders played a few of your bigger gods, reading the Xeroxed versions of the same play as time immemorial, or at least last year. Remember that Parvati was played by Ramrani, a brassy Texan who even as a kid I recognized as some kind of Janis Joplin avatar, who escaped her fate through Dharma, but whose voice and bearing remained. The main roles were played by teens, mostly kids who lived on or near the ashram, who felt feral but free and impossibly older, torn sweatpants, big faces, and maybe matted hair. The young kids, or those who could only come for so long, played monkeys and bears and sometimes birds. Part of Rama's army, led in spirit by Hanuman, the monkey god whose name I bore outside the play, or at least in another one, or demons. I would never play a demon. The kid who played Hanuman puffed out his cheeks, and even more importantly, I would discover, looking in the mirror, those bits right around your lips, the place you'd put a goatee. Imagining, if you will, and I do, yeah, sects are cool, but we have been asking for recommendations, for good advice. I was born in Santa Fe in 1983, my sister in 1990. My parents moved there looking for some place to be. Half the population says their car broke down and they just stuck. Mum and Pup stayed because they arrived on the night of Zozobra, when we burned a 40-foot high effigy of gloom and realized it might be possible to live in North America again. I should say that they are North American. My mother from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, where the winter is minus 40 and the sun is out shorter than banking hours. My father is from Philadelphia, Jewish, but only enough to be bullied, not enough to believe. They felt, as so many did in that moment, that there was nothing there for them, that it was restrictive, that there was a world, that it was blooming, that it was open elsewhere. Life is endlessly complicated and unspeakably simple. They say it is so simple, all you have to do is breathe. And other times, I'm stuck inside weighty questions of the entire world, of the ontologies of hauntings, the epigrammatic inside-outs of being a human, the new rises of fascistic ethno-nationalism and seawater, cultural appropriation, eco-CD, how anti-capitalists can pay the rent, how to turn a t-shirt half inside out so it's a Mobius shirt like I saw in a dream and never on TV. And even though I said it out loud, my phone didn't listen well enough to send me a link the next minute. Like the water bottle patterned like a Dr. Bronner's bottle that the surveillance machine refuses to manifest for me. Like the way it feels to be somewhere, knowing it's different than last time because everything is always changing, but some things change, like looking at water, a surface that implies depth, a space that is always moving but feels still. Anyone who has ever spent a semester looking at static knows what a strange misnomer that is. But from the right vantage point, all movements appear still, all complexity simple. These acts of zooming in and zooming out, they constitute most of our capacity for metaphors for existing and most of our coping strategies. The camera's anxiety is not in zooming in, but in moving. That's one place we've got them beat. They were looking for a new angle. It wasn't fitting there. They felt wild and restless and out of touch with the broken society. In this way, they are not only not unlike me, but just like me. It's hereditary. Society's ills, that is. Our responses are our own, but I recognize that feeling too. When I wrote this, I'd just come back from 2 weeks in the woods, where instead of darshan, we have screenings and performances, studio visits, and instead of encounter groups, we have group encounters. There are still conversations about being and beans. Me, myself, and what I mean. Unencumbered but numbered chalisas, the numbers of which are this and that, but there are 108. Before they had discovered branded contentment. This is a movie you can talk to, after, or even during. I am, I am, I am, I am, I ams. I am, I am, I am, I ams. I am, I ams. I am, I am, I am, I am, I ams. I am, I ams. I am, I am, I am, I ams. I am, I ams. This month marks the anniversary of every one that has come before it. None of these things could have happened before or after, but it's unclear if we feel that way when it's happening. My parents, who were not yet that, met in Kabul, Afghanistan. They were staying at the Mustafa Hotel on the corner of Chicken Street and something else. My father talks about coming home from a night of just walking around trying to figure out how to solve the problems of the world. And he comes home and he's very distraught, and he wakes up in the morning after a restless sleep, and he goes downstairs for a breakfast of toast, butter, jam. He describes the jam as being atomic looking, whatever that would mean in terms of redness. And he all of a sudden feels this strange urge, and he is sitting there and he knocks over the table with his knees. And at least in my recollection, though I wasn't there, the toast sticks to the ceiling, and he just starts running and he's not sure what's going on, and he gets to the bottom of a staircase. And my mother, who is not yet my mother, is walking down the stairs, and he says, "It's you." And she says, "Yeah." After that, they never stopped being together. One winter, my father, who was not yet my father, lived on a farm commune in Quebec, and my mother, who was not yet my mother, with her mother, who was a few provinces away. He would walk in the cold to town to call her, and sometimes she was there, and sometimes not, which makes sense even if you don't think about it. Govinda's goat shack, as his contribution was to be called, never ended up happening in the traditional sense. The RCMP came and raided them, but came up empty-handed, even as my father could see his jeans slung on a hook, like the Jim Croce song he'd note at the time and later. And to get up, he had to wear them, which would implicate them in what their pockets held. Otherwise, they've been together just about every minute since meeting around Thanksgiving, which they don't call it there, of 1971. The intervening time was spent mostly in India, traveling from place to place as spiritual seekers. They spent the bulk of their time with Bhagwan, as I knew him by, or Rajneesh, or Osho, as you might, first in Mumbai, then Bombay, then Pune, for less than a weekend in Oregon, which I never saw and they barely knew, but for the bad vibes, and from the years of trauma that their friends and mine brought with them like refugees escaping back into America, as adults whose resumes were in meditation and joy and then grief. Huey wrote a book called Bhagwan, The God Who Failed, but I remember him more for his hollow airplanes and immaculately empty home in Big Sur, like a Zen meditation center. But that was where he lived and lives now. He's still tall and looks like a Scottish Zeus, including the eyebrows. Not only could you not choose your parents, but they barely choose you. Yiddish for the skittish. Who wore it better, but at an ashram where everyone is wearing the same orange robes, and the magazine is black and white. The anti-ismists at the I Think We've Met gala. The timeliest history of brevity. I have set off smoke alarms smudging with sage. I have confused my own scent with incense and not been incensed. I was missing nostalgia. The small of America. Away from the business cads and yoga parties. I forget sometimes that not all boomers had this experience. I was on a plane on the receiving end of the boomer's life story, whiskey whispering Dylan into my ear while talking about Trump in glowing terms and calling Hillary Clinton the obvious vitriolic misogynist bullshit and then talking about football and having been in the room when Walmart started to sell organic food. I was crestfallen and exhausted. I realized my parents left not just because of their parents, in the general sense, but their peers in the specific sense, too. Eventually, I open Our Hand, a minute second-hand shop that mostly sells clocks, and we talk about time travel until we've aged out of existence. It takes longer to dry than to wet, even in the desert. Even when we try to determine opposites, knowing fully well that means across very specific spectra. Otherwise, the opposite of purple might be couch, or bliss kissing, and someone losing their rock on their way to carving in their names into a tree in 1703 BCE. What we called an army of none, what we called collectivism. Chilling in the name of, aka post-smart, aka also knowing and, yes and, the Prague Improv Band. Anchored quelling association, assumptions kindly asking, another new another, answering, ging, kindling, agog. My father claims that Yom Kippur is about at one mint, which he's right about. Flow is the etymology of flower. Language is becoming, and we make it so and unmake it this, add a li anywhere. Li. Stan is short for Hindustani classical music obsessive. My grandfather was a selfie stick. Some names from their milieu. Acid Paul, Brother James, Blind George, Tom Bombadillo, Sleazy Jerry, Leather Lou, Rama John, Mescaline Bobby, Space Girl, that's my mom, The Fox, Bone, Gate Krishna, Proper Cigar, Juice Bar Cigar, Krishna Press, Soap Priya, Krishna Christ, Giacomo, Mental, Love Song, Cloud Rock, German Govind, Car Govind, that's my dad, Swiss Peter, Hollywood Peter, Scottish Pramod, Steak, a Philly boy who was friends with Lumps, Hari Poo, Chinese Alok, Ramananda Ha Ha, Dr. Amrit, Trumpet Steve, Eight Finger Eddie, Bodie the drummer, Joe Bananas. Looking at correspondence from when I thought my life was ending, but I wasn't telling enough people because I was hoping it wouldn't, and it didn't, but not in the way I was hoping, which itself is coping, which itself is the volta, that little hinge bit of a sonnet where things turn and often rhyme. When my parents turned mid-20s, they arrived in Vancouver with enough treasures to hopefully get them enough money to keep living. My grandfather, Papa Clown, the junk salesman, rug shampoo brewer, and vacuum man of Kingsway Avenue, and Clown, picked them up and went immediately to some place, some city place, and got them a peddler's license. After a day, the sandwich board was heavy, and they put it down, and no one minded, and the next day they put out a sheepskin rug, and no one minded, and by the end of the summer they were packing out and packing up an entire city block of treasures until the rug bulged with cash and they could return. What did Gayatri call Govind in those days, in those letters home before those were their names? Nowadays, I can text questions and vice versa. I've seen the old letters which passed through so many hands. The guy with the peanuts waiting on disability. This was a friend of theirs when they were living in Kabul briefly, and he had some sort of thing where he was waiting on disability check. Maybe he'd been a veteran, and every day waiting, going to the post office. This was the big event of the day, and the rest of the day just getting more and more depressed, and then like going back to his little tiny room and just like waiting for things to end, waiting for this thing to show up. Finally one day he's at the very end of his money, and he goes to the peanut guy who's right in front of the post office, and at that point peanuts would have been served, these hot peanuts would have been served in some kind of paper that had been found, some refuse from somewhere, and they would be in this cone, and he's sitting there, he's eating the peanuts as slowly as possible, kind of meditatively, knowing that this may be the last meal, unclear what exactly one would do with this situation. And he opens it up, and he's looking at the thing, he's looking so closely, trying to taste everything, trying to see everything, trying to really engage his sensorium in a way that'll keep his brain moving, and notices he recognizes the handwriting, and the name, and it's his own, and there was the check to let him keep going. I have checked as few facts as possible. I've tried to maintain magic. I have not doubted that mere belief and intention, what is less mere than that, made famous Amos cookies warm in a rucksack in a new town with someone droning on and on while everyone else zones off and off. Belief is more than the absence of doubt. I used to confuse obtuseness for depth, but as they say, depth is taxing. Amitabh talked about cacti and vines. He noted that some places build scenes easily and others resist them. I am vine, even as I was raised amidst cacti. Manifesting is just DIY for people who think Ram Dass is insane Johnny. AMA is just AKA for IDK. AMA is just Amachi for people who aren't near anyone enough to hug. What Gandhi said about Western civilization, that it would be a good idea. What someone smart must have said about heartbreak. In moving all of my objects recently, I discovered I was roughly half cloth and half paper. Much of this cloth comes in the form of clothing, but an almost equal share is lungies and strips of cloth my parents brought back from India throughout the 70s. I wear them as scarves, as houseware, as towels occasionally. An amount of paper was sourced the same way, even if I almost never wear them. The Hanuman Chalisas are a 40-part devotional song cycle written in the 16th century by the poet Tulsidas. I remember them mostly from all-night singing from Kirtan at the Hanuman temple. I remember them mostly from all-night singing from Kirtan at the Hanuman temple, the repetition, the sonorousness, the sonorous too muchness, and enveloping every one of it is one of my first memories of the transformative and transfixing possibility of sound. I think of it often when listening to noise, when singing together, when in a bliss fog of increasingly more sounding. I took a class in raga singing when I lived in Portland, taught by a white baby boomer whose guru was Pandit Pranat until Nathji died, and mutual pupil and senior disciple Terry Riley took on that mantle. As has often been my role, I wasn't interested in the formal practice, but quickly integrated certain singing modes into my own practice. Showering and cars and streets and sometimes clubs. We can call that a practice of imperfection, a practice of impermanence, as if there's any other kind. Does well when it values unrecorded sound, the slipperiest of presences, the quintessence of still movement and fleeting form. I was writing these words in my studio in Chicago when my mother sent me accidentally cropped images of the Be Here Now manuscript on display at the Hanuman Temple, where they were attending Guru Purnima, an annual festival to honor the Guru, in this case, Neem Karoli Baba. One says, you can't get away from the day because it's in your head and that you're trying to change, you're trying to get away from that, and the only way to get away is to change your head. Simple as that. You want to change your environment? Change your head. It's all the ecstasy moment. If you know how to dig it, if not, it's a travesty. It's a travesty that's all profane. Another page, a second earlier, later never exists. Here we are, and that's all there is. And if that isn't beautiful, man, there's nothing. In the intervening time of writing this and performing this now, Ram Dass left his body, which was a sort of a euphemism, or maybe that connotes a greater level of belief. Maybe all euphemisms do. And this is one of, I think, 3 people who are mentioned in this talk who have died in that intervening time, or left their bodies. My parents met Neem Karoli Baba by accident. They were on a train with overlapping atoms packed beyond gills as civic, cyclic, or strained metaphor of some human condition, smushed flesh becoming one again. As Neem Karoli Baba entered, everyone scooched and revealed comfortable space for this man, large in presence and presence. Wearing just a blanket, he never spoke to them, but, quote, zapped the shit out of us. As the train neared Mount Abu, he gestured for the conductor and asked that he stop at a non-stop, and instructed my parents, before they were that, to get out, to encircle the holy mountain, and to wait at the non-stop stop for tomorrow's train. I had been to India twice, once when I was 10, once when I was 20. I missed 30. Here I am the first time. Here we are the second time. The first time, I was with my parents, and we went to Delhi to see it, to Lucknow to see their then guru, Papaji, and then to Rishikesh, which was my favorite and remains so. Papaji, or Sri Harilal Punja, loved cricket and spit betel nut. He was quite old when we met him, and knew my name was Hanuman without anyone telling him. He had several Western devotees by that time that were leading and holding their own satsangs on tours of Europe and North America. My parents hosted a number of these, both in our living room and in various churches and halls in Santa Fe. I believe deeply that some amount of their hosting of those logistics, as well as that spirit, are what helped me feel so comfortable doing the same. First with punk bands at the local teen art space, and later in cinemas, galleries, bars, and barns, on tour and in the cities I've called home. I think often about the overlaps between religious and artistic practices. Many ways, but most usefully to me in this moment in logistical terms, always needing small runs of prints, always borrowing space to bring people together without financial desire but needing to stay afloat, of creating space and fostering publics with esoteric interests and strange internal languages, often putting out chairs, needing to ensure the right people find them without raising too much attention to others. The scene politics, the considerations of hosting, perhaps belief is in there too. They met in Kabul and shortly thereafter went to India. The Kumbh Mela was happening shortly and they wanted to be there. Upon arriving, their little camp of Western trippers was given their own space as if they too were a sect. Even as they, quote, knew nothing, everyone came to visit them and they quickly jumped into discourse. And one of their friends gave a few swamis acid, conversations flowed. Young people asked, what is infinite? You are. What destroys? All that is. What isn't, it doesn't exist. Finally, a question was asked in Hindi, and after a long, long answer in the same, someone helpfully translated a half hour into English. Live, laugh, and be merry. One of the Vedantic Swamis, the more proper, compared to the naked sadhu with Jeta dreadlocks going more than halfway down his body, said, this is not right. Who is invited? Who is more invited? They said, I don't know. Everyone is. He left. Muktananda in ashes and Jeta noted of his trip. Things are going hither and thither, but everything is perfectly good. Later, my parents, who are not my parents yet, recent lovers, they went for a walk. At some point later, while walking through the camps, the chief of police and a military man, nabbed my father, who was not yet my father, and tied him up, accusing him of poisoning a saint. The, quote, very straight saint came up to them, hogtied, like, quote, on a hammock without a hammock, in the midst of a bad trip. Tony, not yet Govind, not yet my father, offered to go to talk him out of it. The chief of police said, no, this is serious. If he lives, you live. At 3 a.m., he was alive, and so was he. They note still that they hadn't given anyone acid, but were grateful that it had passed. In the morning, they were thrown out. A few days later, they were on a train where they met Neem Baba. Ram Das notes that his Baba kept a diary, and every page was just Ram 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 Ram, 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 for pages and pages, noting every instance of existence. Early in their time there, they were tripping with some other friends, and my dad, who wasn't that yet, wandered into a Buddhist temple and had his mind blown from the murals, not tankas, but like that, of Buddha's life. Before realizing there was a monk next to him doing prostrations, his mind continued to be blown. And when he went back to their encampment, he told his friends, we're out here getting high and fucking around. Well, these guys are doing push-ups to get the fuck out of here, man. They spoke often then about the world, something that was outside of their experience, that described the normative space beyond the ashram walls. That persisted in various forms in the 80s as people drifted into woodworking or hair cutting or papers or cloths or whatever else the world constitutes. There is an uncountable line we can trace between that list of names, the groove balls and seekers, and the dopiest elements of Lululemon excess, and festival bindies and all the other fucked up mishigas of appropriation and flow in a globalized globe. It comes down to power, of course, and to intent. And I can offer the sincerity of a half generation of subculture, but know that it's much more complicated than a term like problematic can hold or attempt to address. I want to shed this language. I want to name the problem. When we talk about a group of relative privilege, at least with the ability to move from one place to another, to use the excesses of their society to move into others, especially one laden with such a severe colonial past. We're describing an act of neo-colonialism that even with the most delicate of approaches bears the scars of these violences. This is the part that I find hardest to reconcile. I'm grateful not to have grown up where my parents did, socially and spatially, and want the great teachings and experiences of time to be of value to all beings. But I know that these so-called exchanges are not always equal. These exact issues, alongside the difficulty of explaining what your family does on the weekend, are some of what we Dharma brats discuss once some strange shibboleth has passed our lips and we discover each other at a gallery, at a screening, at a residency, wherever civilians hang out. I participated in a fellowship for Jewish artists last year. I feel complicated about this identity as someone who feels essentially no connection religiously, and who I was reminded just recently, not even true ownership over within Jewish law, but who, you know. In a recent interview, the not-so-occasional poet laureate of my resting breath, David Berman, that's the second death, described only later realizing what silver Jew, the singular of his singular singing, meant. Someone whose father was Jewish but whose mother wasn't. Someone who isn't invited into the matrilineal coven but still bears the name to a disdaining society. A Jew's Jew, he said, an outsider outside of outsiders. I had mentioned I was half Canadian and half Jewish to a person who believed that neither was possible. And I only agree in the sense that there's nothing about anyone I've ever known that divided so evenly. Identity is mushy, like trying to separate the flour and the yolks and rosewater after you brought a cake home. Even if we can do the math, I don't know who that serves, but those who seek the numbness of numbers, over the nimbleness of soups and swerves. I'm not opposed to math, but have learned much more from mouths. Light becomes us. But it's true, in that there is greater comfort perhaps in my practice overlapping with the legibility of somebody culturally Jewish, rather than the haze of Guru Kid or Dharma Brat. It is much harder to locate us. It is neither matrilineal nor patrilineal, and I haven't found enough data yet to tell me how many generations it lasts. My rebellion was a strange one, trying to be normal, obsessing over sports, pleading for a polo shirt, and to have Ramana Maharshi's photo taken off the family mantle. Some strange period hovering roughly between the ages of 11 and 15, with reverberations beyond. All I wanted was to be normal, even as my every inclination and upbringing fought that. It was through a reawakening of my own freak consciousness that I grew closer to my parents' I remember sitting with my grandmother listening to Frank Sinatra at Bagelmania, longing desperately to be in black and white, to be an East Coaster, to be legibly Jewish, to be urbane and rumpled but in an after-hours kind of way. Then, later, being in Darshan and feeling under air like an amniotic fluid brought to us by Braggs. Wearing sunglasses and feeling high, wanting to float and be floated, clowning in the fog-soaked woods, desert dogging in an ancient cave apartment, shoeslessly stuffing flowers into gun barrels. I wanted to be Spider-Man, I wanted to be Hanuman, Spider-Man, Hanuman, and those were my two favorite comic book characters. And those were the two that I dressed up most often as. In 9th grade, I brought my costume box in English class and improvised some romp through my self-conscious or subconscious or whatever. Who knows what the assignment was. On some level, I keep reperforming this reperformance, whatever the assignment, the assignation. Shining through the trees that night, playing peekaboo with cosmic blocks, unlearning object permanence as I consider my own subject impermanence, like life and death may be opposites, but living and dying can only happen simultaneously. Hearing here, having been, and increasingly more sounding, the honor, the offer, Jai Jai Hanuman. I was a cosmic book and dreary dream, dreaming drearily, rural kids with sannyasin names. I'd seen political diagrams. There were circles, and then, those Humboldt Hickbees with guns and weed. But I wanted and got something more, like the eternal knots, the having and having been. What looking liked was, what looking loved was. Remembering puffing out my cheeks look like Hanuman, later I arrive at the specificity Olympics. In the middle of something generally particular, what you'd recognize from 10 feet away but not 10 inches away, the morning newspaper soaked through and trying to tell me that typos were the greatest access to our subconsciousness, but that autocorrect was a close second. I may not believe in signs from the universe, but seem to believe when they tell me to stop. The billboard on I-5 as you dip into Seattle that said, remember, you aren't in traffic, you are traffic. Fights road rage like the Buddhist parable about the search for spiritual oneness, beginning when the wave begins to wonder why or how they are not the ocean. That's what fights broad rage. Years ago, I named something rage wave, and maybe just seconds ago understood why. Govind loves to say, relax, you were already that, and loves the Nisargadatta book, I Am That. And they were friends with Maurice Friedman, the translator, the Polish-Jewish emigre who constructed Gandhi's spinning wheel, who only accepted help from a nurse on his deathbed when she recognized the person who sent her there as Ramana Maharshi 30 years after his death, and most likely based on the same photograph I'd asked my parents to take down when friends came over. And then somewhere in the Bible, there is a moment when God says to Moses, I am that I am. Another data point in the generalized theory that no religion has a monopoly on truth, but that each hints at the universal consciousness and gets in trouble when dogma and other humans get involved. I was such a good teenage stoner because I'd been trained since birth. haiku for world peace. Seeing the sea, hearing here, taste is taste because they think it happens inside of us, that the processes aren't shared, that we need to simultaneously shut and move our mouths. Mouth talking, mouth tasting, nose smelling, rarely expressing, the perversity of eating tongue, the persistence of teething the young, misspelling my own name as an inverse version of identity theft. I took a course in college called Mind, Brain, and Religious Experience, where I researched clumsily what I believed was a link between cybernetic religious access and expression and a type of hyper-individuated spirituality. This is clearer now than ever, even if the gift collage shrines I was so enamored of didn't seem to last. I talked to my parents about the various issues with a cherry-picked or smorgasbord approach to spirituality, even as I am a subject of postmodernity and have always felt more like a cloud than an arrow, even as I know that purity is a fallacious and dangerous approach. Later that night, I am sent a text. I guess I see my interest or attraction or resonance not as a smorgasbord or a cherry picking, but as a resonance with what all those things are contained in. My mother has replaced her incessant and incandescent use of ellipses with enjambment by iPhone. When we think we're losing it, we're missing what is. This is a work in progress in that everything is like an act of optimism that things will keep happening and keep moving. My parents have more stories from these times than we have time for tonight. Like me, like you, for a tradition that is often set on breaking people from their stories, it engenders a lot of tales. Because I was young and reading the cosmic comic books, I know the three moments I love most. One comes from the Bhagavad Gita, the crux of the Mahabharata, in a moment when Krishna, who as a child was named Govind, has come down to earth to work as Arjuna, the famed warrior's chariot driver. In a moment of panic, Arjuna reveals doubt and a need to connect with the infinite. Krishna, who is an avatar, Vishnu, the preserver, one of the triumvirate of the most esteemed and powerful gods, gives Arjuna a momentary glimpse into the everythingness of the world, the interconnectedness, the celestial, the cosmic, for which he must first prepare him, because a mystical vision of this scale can break a mortal. I've seen dozens of depictions of this moment, and each reveals the challenge for an interpreter, themselves most likely a mortar. Themselves most likely a mortal. Amortal, not immortal. Amortal, and most likely not a warrior, to show in a small panel everything. The other two are from the Ramayana. Rama, another avatar of Vishnu, is easy to spot because he's blue. He is embroiled in a fight for the fate of the world and his love, Sita, with Ravana, the multi-headed demon king of Lanka. At one point, Lakshman, Rama's brother, is wounded in battle. The medic tells Hanuman about Sanjivani, sounds Italian, a sacred herb that will cure him. It can only be found on Drangyari Parvat, a mountain in the Himalayas. Hanuman, having bounded or flown there, as his mother is the wind, is unsure which herb to bring back and carries the entire mountain to the medic. A side note, or side sub number of this, was that when Hanuman was a child, he mistook the sun for a fruit and swallowed it whole before he was told that we needed it. And so he gave it up, he gave it back. Later in the saga, at the very end, which I feel okay spoiling because it is a 2,700-year-old tale at least, everyone is reunited. The demons have been vanquished and there's a celebration. There, Hanuman stands with the royal court in song and tears open his chest to reveal Rama and Sita residing in his heart. Growing up, there was little use for doctrine. Bhagwan provided my parents, who are now my parents, say, what felt like a graduate degree in comparative religion, doing month-long series on a range of traditions. I should note that while trained in academia, these are nonetheless highly subjective and speculative readings, though I note also that that is to say that they all are. Bhagwan was raised a Jain and the son of a cloth merchant. He became a professor of philosophy, and his own philosophy became an exploration of human sexuality, class, meditation, mediation, worldliness, humor, and chaos. The shelf on him at the Chicago Public Library is bracketed by something about aliens and L. Ron Hubbard to give an indication of the esteem with which he is held by the Deweys. Though my parents were long gone before the Oregon shit show, they maintain a deep love for their time with him in the extended community. I remember as a child, when asking about a word that I just heard, my mother noting that cult is a term that comes from the outside. I mean this in no way to excuse anything, but also to note that a religion is just a cult that lasts. The flexible coherence of my spiritual upbringing made more sense when I was younger and felt I too should become an expert in a range of religious experiences and traditions. I tried to understand and read the great texts of the major, or at least lasting, traditions. But continued to find myself finding universalist themes and total befuddlement in dogma. I maintained deep skepticism about authority figures, but a well of compassion for them as individuals. As a teenager, I wanted to take the Bodhisattva vow, which means that you keep reincarnating until all beings, whether they're bugs or bunnies or celebrities or just like us, have achieved enlightenment and no longer have to come back to try again. I see this now as an act of both service towards humanity and my own latent FOMO. As a child, I spent equal time thinking about the Hindu pantheon, those cosmic comics again, and in Tibetan Buddhist spaces. I met the Dalai Lama in preschool, drew a picture of him for the local newspaper. I don't know that it was ever printed. We attended sand mandala ceremonies and met various high lamas, some at the end of their human bodies and later in their next young vessel. I love the way these reincarnations were determined, which included giving infants a choice of different objects from the previous one's lives, bowls, scarves, etc., and seeing what they were drawn to. I believe I wanted to have been somebody of import previously, though I can't imagine I would have taken to monastic life. I loved that there were dyad relationships in which sometimes the teacher was a child and their pupil in their 90s. Like calendar work, I would do a presentation on the plight of the Tibetan people in school, figuring out some way to recite my interests and the jargon I knew, both because it mattered to me deeply and because I knew that the preparation was already done and I could reliably perform. Despite wanting to be normal, meeting the kids that moved to town from Connecticut and thinking the khakis were exotic and beautiful in their banality, I should also note that Santa Fe is teeming with kids whose parents meditate, whose names seemed unrecognizable to their grandparents, whose adobe homes were lined with Tibetan prayer flags. I still find myself muttering Om Mani Padme Hum to a bug if I kill it, to wish for a higher birth. I did it 20 seconds before committing those words to pixels. As a child, I meditated and had mystical visions. I wish this for every child, even if they're in their 50s. I don't meditate much anymore, but I can't say why. I know there are apps now, which I despise, but I won't say why. At the shop that my parents owned, in which I spent my youth in a basket for one, Spirit of the Earth, a name they inherited from the Oklahoma oil baroness whose store they slowly took over after simply showing up to sell her beads they'd strung when we lived in a one-room adobe hut without heat but lots of cloths. I was quietly attuned to when my father would use Tony and when, more rarely, he would use Govind. On all sides, my family has been merchants, often with small shops, hustles to keep them busy and bossless. I think about these often as they relate to being an artist, not in a neoliberal way of artist as entrepreneur, but as a way of framing practice and the challenge of needing to live in a society and engage community, even as the overarching structures seem inhumane. Ragas are a form of structured improvisation, built around repetition and group singing. The individual and collective move around together to produce a sonorous muchness that continues to accidentally form much of my approach to being in public, to dissolving proscenium lines, sometimes at least. I want to end with a song, which can be short for sing-along. As far as bubblegum Zen goes, I prefer Arthur Russell to George Harrison. Recently, Eric Isaacson of Visionary record label and, quote, Money Over Gold record shop Mississippi Records gave a talk near here, Chicago, in which he showed an image of Harrison's palatial mansion to prickle the dead, to problematize the dharmic social justice figure. He noted that after showing the image for years, a friend of Harrison's came up to him and said that George had gone there for years on off weekends to do manual labor, to handyman and refloor one of the 1,000 rooms, to reassert his working class roots. He also noted that George would have liked having the piss taken out of him. This is a song that I admit is the perfect entry in the cheesy Chalisa category, but I hope you'll indulge me since you already have for so long. It's noteworthy too, I think, because essentially it's a doo-wop song. Ronnie Mack successfully sued him for biting the melody the Chiffons made popular with He's So Fine, but that he claimed is more influenced by Edwin Hawkins' gospel rendition of the 18th century hymn by Philip Doddridge. You knew that, sorry. Later remixed and remade in Sister Act 2. It's about Krishna, a god he certainly didn't grow up with, from a country whose latter history is scarred with the deleterious humiliation and violence that his country enacted. I think it's a beautiful song, and in part because it shows the diffident, difficult cultural flows of a burgeoning globalism, the sincere longing of an artist adrift, the problems of so-called universalism when it butts up against big-budget culture, and the various ways that we talk and sing about love and devotion. And this truly can be a song that's short to sing along.
Sweet Lord, my Lord, my Lord, I really want to see you, I really want to be with you, I really want to see you, Lord, but it takes so long, my Lord, my sweet Lord. My Lord, my Lord, I really want to know you. I really want to go with you. I really want to show you love that it won't stay long, my Lord, my sweet Lord, my Lord. My sweet Lord, I really want to see you. I really want to see you. I really want to see you, Lord. I really want to see you, Lord, but it takes so long, my Lord. My sweet Lord.